Hello, this is Sarah Brings with the Professor Podcast, the podcast of your professors, their research, and their academic lives here at St. Thomas. This week, we're delighted to have Amir Mohammad, Senior Teaching Professor of Communication Studies here at St. Thomas. Welcome, Amir.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
So to begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how that led you to your current work here today?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I'm the son of working class immigrants. My mom is from El Salvador. My dad is from Yemen. And for a significant chunk of my life, I grew up with a single mom. And that was pretty significant and important for me. It shaped how I have come to understand the world in a lot of ways. You know, my mom, I watched her work really hard and do everything she could to give her two boys just an amazing opportunity. But her journey, and which in many ways was like our collective journey as a family, it was marked by racism, by xenophobia, by financial hardship, by classism. And as a single mom, I also watched her endure a lot of sort of sexism and misogyny and judgment. And so in many ways, my interest in studying belonging was shaped by seeing my mom be on the outside of belonging. As the years progressed, my mom remarried, and she remarried an alternatively documented Mexican immigrant. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of hateful rhetoric about immigrants these days, and for quite some time now. His name was my stepdad's name was Manuel. And he was alternatively documented. But he was also one of the hardest working people I've ever met. Mm-hmm. One of the most loving people I've ever met, and did everything he could to provide for our family. And in many ways, he was a father figure that I didn't have. But I watched him exist on the outside of belonging too. And so all of these experiences shaped me. When after my mom and Manuel, who I really refer to as my dad, after they got married, they put their pennies together, and they were able to buy a house in the suburbs in a predominantly white neighborhood. And they did that because they wanted their boys to have as much opportunity as possible. I don't think they could have understood or known how hard that transition would be, though. Mm-hmm. I'm originally from California. I grew up when we moved here. We experienced just my mom and her two boys. We experienced housing insecurity, and we lived on the west side of St. Paul, a historically Latino neighborhood. But throughout that upbringing, I had always been in spaces of color, or very, very rich multicultural spaces. And so when my mom and Manuel moved us out to the suburbs, mm-hmm. It was really for the first time that I wasn't in that sort of space. And I started to question my place and my sense of belonging. And I certainly felt that in school. I am so proud of who I am and where I come from today. But that wasn't always the case. I remember in high school internalizing a lot of negative messages, a lot of racist messages mm-hmm. about what it meant to be a person of color, what it meant to be from a working class family. And so on the outside, I did my best. I did okay. But certainly on the inside, I felt on the outside of belonging. And so all of these experiences, again, they certainly shaped my life, my interest in studying and talking about belonging. It wasn't until I got to college where I found a community that was genuinely interested in knowing who I am, where I come from, what I'm about. It was there where I didn't feel like I had to fit in. I just had, my job was just to be me, like to just show up and be me, and that was enough. And that was so powerful, so powerful. It just absolutely changed the trajectory of my life to experience that. And so that developed in me an interest and desire to work in higher ed, because I was like, wow, like how cool. College can be a place that changes your life. And so that kind of set the stage for me to learn more and study more and research belonging. So.
What a powerful journey. What is it about feeling a sense of belonging, and what does that feeling entail that is so important for someone's development, especially in an academic setting?
Mm-hmm, yeah. So what the research tells us, particularly for first-gen students, for BIPOC students, is that belonging moves the needle on achievement, on persistence, and also there's a qualitative component where it just feels better, right? And so that's great. That's great that there's research that tells us that, right? But honestly, we don't need the research to tell us that, right? I think we all know we learn best when we feel known and seen and valued, right? And so belonging is absolutely critical. There are a lot of ways to define belonging, and there's tons of scholars doing work on belonging. Very few of us agree on how to define it, and I wouldn't try to sort of provide a universal definition of belonging. But in 2024, in a book called Belonging Without Othering, some scholars out of Cal Berkeley offered us a compound definition of belonging that sort of has 4 elements to it. And I think that can be helpful. It's certainly, again, not the only way to define belonging, but it's one way, and I think it's a good frame for us to have. One, they say belonging entails inclusion. That's a necessary condition, right? So if you're going to belong, you have to be a part of the space. But that's honestly a really low bar, right? Because I can include you in the space and put you in the corner, right? You're included, but you're in the corner. If I'm extra generous, I can include you in the space, and you might even sit at the table, but you're still a guest. You're included, but you're still a guest. You're not a full participant. And so they say, yeah, but we have to understand this is a necessary condition for belonging. All right, so inclusion is a part of it. The second piece they offer is that they say there also has to be recognition, right, or visibility, right, so that when I operate in a community, I can see that I am seen, I'm valued, and I can see myself throughout the community. So when I walk in to the View here at St. Thomas, or to Cornerstone Kitchen on the Minneapolis campus, I can see pieces of me reflected, right? So recognition and visibility are a second component that we might consider as a part of belonging. The third component is a little bit hard to measure, right? But they say there's this sort of sense of connection, this feeling. You feel connected. And so the idea of recognition and visibility and that sense of connection really go hand in hand, right? When we see ourselves reflected, when we see our identity affirmed, we also feel a closeness and a bond and those positive feelings. So that's an element of belonging. But the final element that they offer is they say that agency. Belonging also has to entail agency. And so this goes back to inclusion, right? When we think about being a guest in the space versus a full participant has some power within the space, right? That they can say, hey, my voice matters, and I might not get everything I want, but I have the capacity and I can contribute to how decisions are made here. And so these are the ways that I think of belonging. These sort of 4 components I think are particularly helpful. And like I said, we know that when scholars, I call students, sometimes you'll hear me say scholars or students interchangeably, but when scholars experience belonging, we know it absolutely moves the needle. And I think this is super critical, right? Because we talk here at St. Thomas about the common good, and I'm so grateful that we do. But when we all show up as our best selves, think about the impact we can have.
For sure.
But what are we missing when we're not all able to show up as our best selves? When we feel like half of us walks through the door, I have to check part of my identity. I have to just fit in. We're missing out on so much. And so fundamentally, this is also about the common good.
Why do you think that there's so many gaps and barriers in education, a system that is meant to feel, that everyone's meant to feel like they belong in, especially in higher ed, where everyone fills out the same applications. They go through the same process of admittance. Why do all of those barriers still exist?
That's a very, very good question. So the question is, why do they exist? There are a lot of ways I could take that. I think there are very few models for us to look at to see how it could be done different. You know, I think that's part of it. I think power and privilege are a part of it. You know, when you lack will and you have power, then it's a good recipe for the status quo to stay in place. And so I think what that says to me is that it's really critical for institutions. Institutions hold power, but also there's institutions are made up of people, right? And people inside institutions hold power. Professors hold power, right? And so one of the things I focus on in particular is academic belonging. How do we cultivate belonging in the classroom? Because sometimes we think about institutional belonging and we're like, well, that's too big.
Yeah.
I can't. But we all, you know, as faculty members, we all have a space that we're entrusted with. And so what can we do in those spaces? And so I think, power is a key piece of why these barriers still exist. And I think a lack of will sometimes, or a complacency. I think other times it's not, it's not mean-spirited. Sometimes people would love to cultivate belonging in their classrooms, would love to cultivate belonging at their institution, right? And again, it comes back to this idea that, well, what does that look like? How do we do that work, right? And that I think takes some figuring out together. But we also know we're also sort of producing knowledge and generating understanding of how to do that work. So we can do that work for sure.
So, as someone who has obviously experienced what it feels like to not belong in these spaces, and as someone who researches this, what would a hypothetical classroom look like that affirms a student's identity and helps them feel a sense of belonging?
I love that. I think the very first thing we have to consider is that not all classrooms and not all scholars come from the same space and need the same things, right? And so hypothetically, I guess I would say it depends on who the scholar is, right? Because they might need different things. But in general, I would say that, gosh, when you walk into that classroom, wouldn't it be cool if your professor knew you by name?
Yeah.
You know, and they throughout the class period, you offered something and they said, "Yeah, Sarah, that's great." And then maybe Jerry chimes in and the professor said, "Well, Jerry, share a little bit more," right? And it's so simple, right?
So simple.
Just using somebody's name to affirm their identity is a powerful thing, right? I'm in a space, this person who is in charge knows my name. They get excited when I share. I don't have to be right. I can make mistakes, right? Belonging empowers us. It imbues us with the freedom to try, to contribute, right? When we don't feel like we belong, we retreat. We put walls up. We try to survive, right? And so if you walked into that hypothetical classroom, I think in general, your identity would be affirmed. It would be probably pretty lively at times. I would hope that you would feel like you can contribute academically. You'd feel connected, confident, but also like, we walk into the classroom as real people with whole lives, right? And so sometimes it's not just about what we're studying that day. Sometimes I'm walking in with something that's in the way of me being able to learn, and I just need to be able to tell somebody, hey, I'm bringing this with me into this space. That matters. Can we talk about it after class? I'd love to know more if you're willing to share. And now I have a responsibility as a professor. Am I going to follow up with you, or is that the end of it, right? And so a classroom that is sort of based on belonging, I think it might look like that. I would also offer that, because I think this is important, I think there would be a whole heck of a lot of learning going on. I genuinely do, right? So belonging doesn't these are not mutually exclusive. It's not like we're talking about, hey, let's be all soft and warm and fuzzy and forget about the learning. No. We're going to learn. And the belonging is going to allow us to go deeper and learn even more. And so what does that classroom look like? High achievement. High expectations, but a whole heck of a lot of love and support to get there.
Yeah. I think a sense of belonging is important for all students to succeed, but why is it especially important for BIPOC students specifically?
Yeah, so I think, there's something called the hidden curriculum, right? And oftentimes, BIPOC students or scholars are unaware of the hidden curriculum. And so part of how we combat that is to sort of cultivate that sense of belonging. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, we know that When scholars of color, when first-generation scholars, when they experience this belonging, we know it moves the needle on academic achievement. We know it moves the needle on persistence, right? So this is critical that our first-gen students, our BIPOC students, our historically underrepresented students, period, experience this. Identity is everywhere. You walk down the hall and you see the paintings on the wall. Identity is there, right? You walk in the cafeteria, you see the food there, identity is there, right? You go up an elevator and you listen to the music, identity is there. Identity is always there, right? The question is, whose identity is there, right? And oftentimes, it's not our BIPOC scholars. It's not students that are coming from first-gen backgrounds, right? And so belonging, true belonging, really allows our scholars to be able to see and feel and experience a university that is theirs just as much as anybody else's.
That's great. And I'm just curious, how have you gone about researching this topic? Are there any methods that you've used specifically or frameworks you've used to go about it?
So there are a lot of different ways to measure belonging. And there are a lot of ways to produce knowledge. For me personally, I view my life as text. And I believe critical reflexivity is a valid way to produce knowledge. Are there other more celebrated, accepted ways to produce knowledge? For sure. In the academy, we love to write things. I like to write things too, but we like to count things, measure things that way. But there are other ways to know things. There are other ways to produce knowledge. And so for me, critical reflexivity, sort of really reflecting on my life, reflecting on the experiences of scholars in a sort of autoethnographic way, is important. Storytelling is also a very significant way where we can come to knowledge, but also produce knowledge. And this comes out of critical traditions, critical theoretical traditions. And so for me, those are sort of my primary methods that I try to use. When other opportunities present themselves, if it makes sense to do a different sort of methodological approach, I'm not opposed to that. But in general, I find the richest work that I do comes from reflecting on my personal experiences as well as the experiences I'm having with scholars on a regular basis. But there was, in 2021, a sociologist by the name of Lisa Nunn published a book. It's literally called College Belonging. And what Lisa Nunn did is she looked at a private university and a public university, and she took a cohort at each university, she looked at continuing generation students and first generation students and really studied how do they experience belonging. Yeah. And what she found was that what the students reported is that they experience belonging in 3 different realms, right? One is campus community belonging. So we might think about that as institution-wide belonging, like I belong at St. Thomas, right? That's one realm that students experience belonging. Another realm is social belonging. I have a group of friends. I have a community. I may be a part of a club. I might be a part of a sports team. I find a strong sense of social belonging in that group or in those groups. And then the third realm is academic belonging. So I have the chops to be here, but not only do I have the competence to be here, I also possess the confidence to participate in the life of the academic community, and I feel connected enough to interact and to sort of to contribute. And so what does that look like? It looks like I'm not afraid to raise my hand in class, right? I know I belong as a part of this academic community. I understand that it's okay to visit professors during their office hours. I experience academic belonging. And so this is important because prior to, for a long time, colleges and universities have been saying, go find your people, go, there's a club for everybody, go find your club, go to professors' office hours, right? But that doesn't work very well for first generation scholars. And part of that is because belonging is always bestowed by the community. It's never seized, right? And so I used to, I don't golf that much anymore, Sarah, but once upon a time, before I had kids, I loved to golf. And, if I was the best golfer in the world, Augusta National, a very famous golf club, would not have to allow me to belong, right? If I had the most money in the world, which I don't, right? Augusta National would not have to let me belong, right? And that's because belonging is always bestowed by the community, right? And so when we think about, to bring that back into our college context, when we say to people, go find your club, go do this, go do that. Well, that's not exactly how belonging works. The community, we have to sort of actively invite people into belonging, as opposed to putting the onus on the individual to go find belonging, right? So what can we be doing as a community, as a university, to invite people into belonging in our own capacities? It doesn't matter what office you work in, whether it's financial aid, whether you're a physics professor, whatever office you're in, you can invite people into belonging. I started my career in higher ed as a hall director, and so a residence hall director. You lived in the res halls?
I did.
You did. Okay. All right. So I had residents who would, they would come to me and they would ask me questions about their math homework, and they would ask me questions about financial aid, and they'd ask me all kinds of questions. And at first I felt kind of flattered. I was like, oh, they must think I'm really smart, but that wasn't it, actually. They trusted me. They felt safe, right? And so they felt like they could ask me those questions, right? But what if, instead of asking me about their physics homework, which I couldn't help them with, or their financial aid, which I could maybe help them with, what if they experienced belonging in all of those places? What if when they went into those spaces, they felt welcomed, right? So this is our work. We all have power in different ways, How are we using that power? Are we going through the motions, checking the boxes? I like to use the word perfunctory, Like, is it just routine? Check in, check out, punch in, punch out. Or do we see this as an opportunity to have a connection with somebody? Again, it comes back to the common good. I'm going all over the place, but I love this. This Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So, when that scholar comes into the financial aid office, right, maybe we're helping them. but I want to believe it's really helping all of us. It's helping the community. It's all for the common good.
That's great. Thank you. So how do these ideas of belonging and the hidden curriculum and all of these challenges that students can face impact the work at Doherty Family College here at St. Thomas?
I love that. Yeah. We work so hard to unpack the hidden curriculum. We work so hard to make our learning transparent, right? And of course, we work hard to cultivate belonging. Now, one of the critical things we do, and one of the tools we use to do that, is culturally sustaining pedagogy. In general, I would say asset pedagogies. Now, culturally sustaining pedagogy is founded on the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. It's actually she developed culturally relevant pedagogy in the early 90s, and she gave sort of 3 pillars to think about culturally relevant pedagogy. Students have to experience academic success in the classroom. They have to experience cultural competence. They have to have their cultures affirmed, right? And then they have to have a socio-political consciousness. They have to be given tools to sort of understand oppression and to call it out and to combat it. In the early 2000s, Sammy Alim and Django Paris started sort of remixing, and actually Dr. Gloria calls it remixing culturally relevant pedagogy. And so they started saying, well, we need to do more than just be relevant. And so they make this rhetorical shift from relevance to sustenance. We need to be culturally sustaining. And they deepen that work of Dr. Gloria by saying, yes, we need to experience academic success, but we also need to call into question what standards, what's the canon, right? Are we interrogating the standards we're measuring students by? Are these simply white middle class norms, or are these holistic norms? Are we interrogating our disciplines? Are we inclusive in our disciplines, right? And then in terms of cultural competence, they say, yes, students must experience their culture in the classroom, but we have to start to understand that people have intersectional identities, and culture's like really fluid, right? And so we have to stop thinking about our BIPOC students in stagnant ways. We have to accept that, a kid of color from the city might like skateboarding and metal music, right? Like, we might not think of that, we might not associate that with a kid of color from the city, but we have intersectional identities, and we have dynamic identities, and so we have to be able to be, our understanding of cultural competence has to grow, right? And then finally, in terms of socio-political consciousness, they say that is good. We need to be able to do that, but we also need to be able to turn that reflexive lens onto ourselves and our own communities, and think about ways in which all communities, including the ones that we come from, produce harm, and we need to call those things out. So I lay that foundation down because that is truly the type of work that we're trying to do at DFC. Is we are trying to embody that in our teaching. Parker Palmer is a famous educator. He says, we teach who we are. And so the question I always like to ask is, yes, but who are we, right? And so what does that mean, right? It means, what music do you listen to? Who's in your closest circle of friends? Where do you practice your faith? What foods do you eat? All of these things shape and influence who we are and how we move through the world and how we show up, right? We teach who we are. But if we have just a very small, narrow world, then we reproduce a small, narrow world. But when we open ourselves up to a bigger world, which is really part of what culturally sustaining pedagogy is trying to do, is to say, I see you. I know who's in this classroom, and I celebrate that. And we can use that as a tool for you to learn.
Thank you so much for joining us, Amir.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
It was great to have you. To learn more about his work, you can find him on the Minneapolis campus of the University of St. Thomas. The Professor Podcast is brought to you by the St. Thomas Libraries. I'm your host, Sarah Brings. The producer and library staff are Mary Davidson and Andrea Kepi. Thank you so much for our guests and to you, our listeners.